So I got some valid criticism on my tier list, and to be fair, if I applied all of the criticism I received to a video like that, it would be hours long covering every build and why they are good or bad. So in this case, I'll be highlighting a handful of builds that I felt were S tier, as well as some of the lower ranked builds and explaining why they fell into those categories. Additionally, I'll be highlighting some of the boon DPS options and heal options as well, which I did cover in the tier list, but those were notably shorter than the DPS tier list that I did. Anyone in the know with experience in the game or have watched my other videos on the individual classes may have felt that my explanations in the tier list video were satisfactory, but in any case, we will take a deeper look at some of these builds and why I feel they landed where they did. Before we get started, I will do a disclaimer. My focus was on analyzing and judging the meta builds and how they were played in the meta. I will largely use those builds to make these judgments, and any significant changes to a build would land it in kind of the off meta category or some alternate variation, which is hard to judge overall since any variety of things can be taken for individual circumstances. There was and will be some generalizations made, but overall the meta is what it is, and you don't have to subscribe to it if you don't want to. There are plenty of players playing core builds that outperform people following meta builds, but they are few and far between. The meta is what it is for a reason. So without further ado, let's talk about what makes a build good in Guild Wars 2. First thing I'll say is nearly every build in the game is plausible. Even if I feel a build is overly complicated or suboptimal, you can still clear content. Guild Wars 2 is a game that doesn't really require the levels of optimization you see touted in a lot of these builds, outside of the most extreme hardcore content, of course. The first and foremost thing that I feel makes a good build or a bad build is actions per minute, or APM. The APM of a build will determine how fast you need to perform actions to get effective DPS. Some of these actions are skill presses, some of them are weapon stows, some of them are even pauses to ensure that you don't cancel a channeled skill. Regardless of what the action is, being able to match the tempo of a build, fast, slow, or intentional, and what that tempo looks like will determine if a build is good or bad in a generalized sense. When covering Hollowsmith, I mentioned that in the hands of a skilled player, this build is an S tier build, but on average, it is far less effective by unskilled or casual players who may be new to the class or just trying things out. And because of that, you need to average the skill difference between those players and put the class in its respective category. Additionally, some of the actions that you need to perform might take some level of intuition. Many builds have skills that are not easily tracked, skills that are inside of kits, inside of a shroud, or locked behind some resource management mechanic. All of these aspects come into play as well. So let's take a look at the first build that I'm going to highlight, and I will explain why it is S tier. Let's take a look at the Power Spellbreaker. I mentioned that the rotation is easy to follow, it has large amounts of self-boon application, and is highly survivable. This build uses strength, defense, and Spellbreaker trait lines, which give you the trait Great Fortitude, which boosts your health pool. It gives you Adrenal Health, which heals you for using your burst skill. Hardened Armor, which gives you frequent resolution procs and inherent damage reduction, and Stalwart Strength, which gives you stability when disabling a foe. But the inherent advantages continue into the Spellbreaker line, with Full Counter giving you a free block and DPS increase, allowing you to reset your burst skill, Dispelling Force, which gives you inherent boon strip, and Magebane Tether, which gives you a lot of self-might. Combine this with the use of Dagger Base and Hammer, and you are constantly proccing your self-stab, you are constantly removing boons, and you are constantly getting healed from Adrenal Health. You have an insane amount of CC built into those weapon sets inherently. Additionally, this warrior build is able to bring the Elite Banner in place of Winds of Disenchantment for God tier utility, something that neither the Bladesworn nor the Berserker are able to do since their elites are required for their builds to function properly. Comparing this build to something like the Condi DPS Scourge or the Condi Virtuoso, or even the Power Soul Beast, and you will find a lot of similarities. Scourge has built-in Condi cleanses, its best in slot weapon strips boons and generate boons. The Virtuoso has insane amounts of CC through Signet of Humility, Signet of Domination, Sword 4, and F3 all built into the best in slot weapons for the build. And Soul Beast has an easy to follow rotation and the ability to take Dolyak stance, Moa stance, Entangle, or any variety of utility to help make things easier for your group. Compare any of these 4 builds to the Bladesworn or the Deadeye or the Weaver. Many of these builds have channels that you can inadvertently cancel. You have rotations that require resource management in terms of flow or initiative. And for the Weaver, you have a mix of full attunements and mixed attunements that you need to track in order to maximize their effectiveness. Combine this with the lack of inherent utility, meaning that even if you were able to not break the build by swapping skills out, some classes just lack any skills that are compatible or comparable to those of the S tier builds. And you see this in the difference between my opinion of the Power Tempest and Alacrity Tempest and the Power Weaver. The Power Tempest I ranked as an A tier build primarily due to its lack of CC, which keeps it from being S tier. However, it has an easy to understand rotation, large amounts of available group utility due to the Tempest specialization, and utility skills available to it. While some of the filler skills are blind, as I mentioned earlier, they are not nearly as critical for the rotation as some other builds. Sure, if you cancel your air overload, you're going to have a bad time, but even with that, you can easily reset it by following through with your rotation. A build like Hollowsmith is far more punished from overheating in its power variation and can completely gimp your build off of one mistake. In terms of boon DPS, things get a little more tricky since you are constantly considering DPS availability versus supportiveness. Some boon DPS are damn near the same as their full DPS counterparts, while others are more similar to a hybrid between a heal specialization and a DPS specialization. When I put Herald in S tier, it is self-explanatory. Boon Heralds are super easy to generate all the key boons in a large radius, the DPS rotations are easy to follow, and they have the ability to lean heavily in one direction or the other based on what non-glint legend you decide to pick. Shiro for DPS, Dwarf or Ventari for utility. Anyone that claims that the boon DPS Herald is not S tier just doesn't really understand the game. And nobody made that comparison, I'm just using it as an example. But when you have builds like the Quickness Berserker versus the Power Quickness Scrapper, how do you actually want to evaluate them? The Power Quickness Scrapper brings significantly more to the group through its use of gyros, including Function Gyro, which is a built-in res tool. Throw Mine, Grenade Kit, or even things like Sneak Gyro can be useful given the right circumstance. Combine this with an ease of understanding on how the build works, inherent survivability through traits like Impact Savant, and you have easy justification for at least an A tier build. The Berserker, on the other hand, has a more rigid playstyle, more rigid use of utilities, and it's just not as good. Moving on to healers, ArenaNet has done a good job of standardizing the roles and building certain specs into that healer class. Some of these classes have multiple specs that can fulfill the heal role, while others are more or less shoehorned in. Heal Firebrand, for instance, is an obvious choice, while Heal Willbender is clearly more forced. Just through the nature of how the boons and healing get applied, it should be obvious that Firebrand is better than Willbender, and even still, there are encounters where Willbender is better. Heal Herald versus Heal Renegade is an even clearer option, where Renegade is significantly worse than Heal Herald. I suppose that the drama really arises when you are comparing classes against each other. How do you rectify a Heal Herald and a Heal Firebrand? And the rub is you really can't. You have to make generalizations regarding what the class brings and if it is useful. Rangers are great when any push mechanic is required, be it Keep Construct, Samurag, Desmina, or when you need snares like on Escort or Gorseval. And it's true, the extra sweaty amongst the Guild Wars 2 community just negate the majority of these mechanics through strategies that are practiced and fine-tuned with groups of people who have been playing together for sometimes years. But you can't do a tier list based on just that. A speedrun tier list would look different. So if I were going to give general advice to somebody who wants to be a healer, I would often recommend Firebrand, Druid, Herald, and of course the Chronomancer, since they are effective even by unskilled players and absolute animals in the hands of an experienced player. So despite the fact that I ruffled some feathers in regards to my first and only tier list that I ever did, of which I only posted after playing and covering the vast majority of builds that I mentioned, I must firmly state it is okay for you to disagree with me. It is a game, play whatever you want. And if you want to be a sweat lord playing nothing but Weaver and asking where stab is every time you get CC'd, you are free to do so. In fact, I find it hilarious. You are also free to no notice kick me out of any of your groups if I'm playing poorly. I promise you it's okay and there are no hard feelings. And with that, I hope this video has helped you understand my mindset in regards to this game and the available builds and classes and what I feel makes them good or bad. I want to thank you for watching. A special thanks to all of my subscribers and my member, singular. So if you dig the content, consider giving me $1 and becoming a member. My man Gary is getting lonely being the only one. That being said, thanks again for watching. Swing by the live stream Saturday mornings or evenings from 06 to 8:30 a.m. PST and say what's up right here on YouTube. All right, that's enough of me selling out. Thanks again, guys, and I will catch you on the next one. Peace.